Slow motion can add plenty of interest to footage in certain circumstances. In this video I will show the correct way of applying slow motion to footage taken with the DJI Mini 3 and 3 Pro using different frame rates. When shooting landscape footage far away from the target, which is often the case with drones, slow motion is not really useful, especially if there are no moving elements in the shot. But anytime we have moving elements, we can add much more interest to the scene by slowing down the action. When we get closer, slow motion becomes even more essential to convey a different mood to the scene. As you can see, slow motion adds a lot of interest not only to sport and action, but also to group of people walking or dancing, and even to waves, fountains, waterfalls or vehicles. You can see a few examples of slow motion applied to footage shot both with drones and ground-based cameras. Another spectacular effect is obtained by speed ramping, suddenly slowing down from regular speed to slow motion, or the other way around. Many users ask if it is possible to simply slow down footage while editing to get slow motion. Well, it is always possible to accelerate footage in post-processing without major loss of quality. But the same is not true when slowing it down, as we can see from this example of footage shot at the same frame rate of the project and simply slowed down in post-processing, compared to slowdown obtained from a higher frame rate interpreted in the frame rate of the timeline. Let me explain why. The most used frame rate are 24 or 30 frames per second, which are actually 23.976 and 29.97. Sometimes 25 is also used, but for the sake of simplicity let's focus on the two most used, 24 and 30. 24 is traditionally the one used in Europe. It is associated with PAL TV standard. This is due to the frequency of electricity, which in Europe is 50 Hz, double of 25. 30 frames per second is traditionally more used in the United States, where the frequency of electricity is 60 Hz, and it is the one used by NTSC TV standards. Nowadays, 24 or 30 are the one used in most cases for cinema, while 30 frames per second is used mostly for TV news, sport and reality TV. Here I will concentrate on 24 frames per second, as it is considered the most cinematic, and also because it offers more options for slow motion. Before starting any project, I set the timeline on my video editor to 23.976 frames per second, and I will be encoding and publishing at this frame rate. When shooting footage, I will set the frame rate to the same value, 24 frames per second, unless I intend to do slow motion, in which case I will go for a higher frame rate. A very simple example. We have 4 seconds of footage shot at 24 frames per second, so a total of 24 multiplied by 4, which equals 96 frames. If we want to double the speed, we need 2 seconds of footage still at 24 frames per second, therefore 48 frames. We have plenty of frames available. All the software has to do is drop half of the frames and keep the 48 needed, so it can basically maintain the same quality. If we want to speed it up by 4 times, we only need 1 second of footage, and again there are plenty of frames, and the program will drop 3 frames out of 4. But if we need to slow down our second clip to half speed, the software this time has to fill 8 seconds and need 192 frames. 24 frames by 8 seconds. but only has 96, so he needs to somehow create new frames, and this is where the quality declines, whatever method we use. The best way to slow down a clip is to start with a higher amount of frames. In our example, if we start with a 4-second clip shot at 48 frames per second, which is double 24, we have a total of 192 frames. If we slow down the speed by half, we end up again with an 8-second clip. Since our project is at 24 frames per second, we need 24 by 8 seconds, which equals 192. We have exactly the frames we need. The best results are obtaining when using a frame rate that is a multiple of the one used in the timeline, so that all the frames are used. But other frame rates are sometimes used. For example, it is possible to shoot at 30 frames per second and encode at 24, in order to get a 20% slowdown effect, which is used quite often in movies. But the software has to create 1 frame out of 5. This can cause small artifacts, but the result is good enough for most usages. We can also use 60 frames per second for a 60% slowdown effect. In this case, some frames will again be extrapolated. The basic Mini 3 offers a maximum frame rate of 30 frames per second at 4K resolution, and 60 frames per second at 2.7K and 1080p. Therefore, it doesn't have any real capabilities for slow motion at the highest resolution. On the other hand, the Pro model has a maximum frame rate of 60 frames per second at 4K. By choosing the option slow motion on the video menu, we can get a frame rate of 120 frames per second at 1080p. For extreme 5x slow motion. The 120 fps is automatically slowed down and doesn't need to be converted in the frame rate of the timeline. This is a significant feature in favor of the Mini 3 Pro for users seriously interested in shooting footage, as it is the only lightweight model to offer real slow motion capabilities. Sadly, there are a couple of limitations in the use of frame rates above 30 frames per second. When shooting for slow motion, in some cases we want to track a subject, but the intelligent flight modes are only available up to 30 frames per second, including Action Track and Spotlight, the two most useful ones for tracking. The zoom capabilities at 4K resolution and frame rates higher than 30 frames per second are not available. I hope that upcoming firmware upgrades will solve both limitations. The process to get slow motion from a higher frame rate is quite simple, and it is the same for all video editors. Here I will be showing how it works in Premiere Pro, probably the most widely used. I will show 2 different methods to make sure that the editor you will be using contains at least one of them. After dropping the first clip in the timeline, the frame rate of the project is set by going to Sequence, Sequence Setting, and at the top we choose the time base at 23.976, practically 24. If we drop in the timeline a clip shot at 48 frames per second, double the frame rate of the project, it will still play at normal speed. We need to slow it down to half speed, and there are 2 ways to do it. The more flexible one is to go to the icon of the clip on the window at the left, right-click on it, and choose Modify and then Interpret Footage. Then in frame rate we select Assume this frame rate and enter 23.976. The clip now plays at half speed, as 48 frames are played at 24 frames per second, which is exactly half. The original frame rate of the file is kept in memory and can always be retrieved if needed. This can be useful when working on a project with plenty of files with different frame rates. It is also possible to batch modify several clips by selecting them, right-clicking, and choosing Assume this frame rate. Another method that can be used is simply right-clicking on a clip in the timeline and choosing Speed Duration, We are presented with this window where we can enter the desired speed in percentage. In this case we have a 48 frame per second clip and we want to slow it down to half speed, so we enter 50%. The duration of the clip displayed just below will double. When using this second method, we must enter the correct percentage of speed reduction according to the frame rate at which the file was shot. Assuming as usual a timeline of 24 frames per second, if the footage was shot at 30, we must enter 80%. For a file shot at 48, enter 50%. For one shot at 60, enter 40%. Note that when we shoot with the Mini 3 Pro in slow motion mode, therefore at 120 frames per second at 1080p, the file is automatically interpreted and we don't need to reduce the speed. Some people may ask, what about shooting always at 60 frames per second, just in case we should decide to slow it down at a later stage, since it is possible to use the 60 frames per second footage at normal speed? Well, I suggest planning in advance and shooting at higher frame rates only footage that we want to slow down. 60 frames per second footage produces bigger files, require more processing resources, and it is not as cinematic when played at normal speed on a 24 frames per second project. Click on this link to know how to set the Mini 3 Pro for cinematic footage. And don't forget to hit the like button if you find this video interesting. Thank you.